So look at cost volume profit analysis. This helps us to understand the relationship between costs, your production level, or what we call your volume of activity, and profits. How do they relate? So we use the word CVP analysis, meaning cost volume profit analysis. You can look at the first video on cost volume profit analysis to see the theory aspects and what we said about this topic. It is also known as a break-even analysis. It helps us to understand how do you calculate your break-even points. You're saying your break-even point is where there is no profit, no loss. Where you have no profit and no loss. So if we draw this on a diagram, what we have is this. This is your sales line, and this is your cost line. At the point where your cost meets your sales, it says your break-even point. This line shows your quantity produced. This line relates to your cost and sales. So what is the quantity produced? At this point, you can see that from this first line, you can see that the cost line is higher than the sales line. So at this point, the person is making a loss. And here, the sales is higher than the cost. So the sales line is higher than the cost line, so you're making a profit. However, where both of them meet is your break-even point. So whatever quantity is produced at this break-even point is what you call your break-even quantity. It can be calculated in units and in value. So the application, let's look at the application of CVP analysis. What can it be applied to? Also note that, to mention also that this sales, the cost line, you can see where the cost line starts. It starts from this point. It's not starting from the 0 point, which means it starts from this point. What it means is that cost cannot be cost can never be zero. Probably I should have slanted this line better more, so that let's just slant this line better. So we take this back, we slant it better so that we make sure that the cost also have a variable position on it. So the cost line, so we say this is our break-even points. So you can see that the cost line flew upwards, telling you that there is also a variable on cost. You know, a fixed cost is usually constant. That is why this line will remain. There's the invisible line here of fixed cost, which is constant. But if you remove that, merge it together, you will have a line that slopes upwards. So that is your total cost line. It has both variable and fixed in it. So that cost line, you can see starting from the point where we can see it's starting from this point. showing that this is not starting from the 0 point, because sometimes costs, even when you're not producing, that is, even when production is 0, cost will still be incurred. If you have paid rent, if you like to produce or not, your costs will still be incurred. That's why it's starting from that point, because cost can never be 0. So we'll go back to where we are, the application of CVP analysis. One, it can be applied to calculate your break-even point. A break-even point in units. So, which means how many units will we sell in order to break even, whereby we are making no loss, no profit. The formula to calculate it says fixed cost divided by contribution margin. Where your contribution margin, I use it as CM, is calculated as selling price minus your variable cost for 1 unit. Variable cost per unit. Note, it is not the total variable cost, just the variable cost per unit. Number 2, it can be used to calculate your break-even point in value. That is, how much will I sell? Now we are dealing with Naira. If you are dealing with dollar, it means I'm talking about in value, dollar or Naira, the case may be, wherever you are. The break-even point in value is calculated as fixed cost divided by contribution margin ratio. Contribution margin ratio. The contribution margin ratio, I call it as CMR. Contribution margin ratio is calculated as contribution margin, like we stated above, divided by selling price. Or this can be further broken down as the contribution margin on top. Can break it down, which is selling price minus variable cost per unit divided by selling price. So this is how to calculate the amount of sales, the value of sales, in order to break even. Number 3, CVP analysis can be used to calculate sales in units. Sales in units required to achieve a target profit. Sales in units required to achieve a target profit. So how many units will I sell in order to achieve a target profit? So you have a targeted profit you want to achieve in that year. You can now calculate how much or how many units will you sell in order to achieve that target. So the formula says fixed cost plus the target profit the targeted profit divided by contribution margin. Number next, 4. You can also use it to achieve sales in value. How much will you sell in order to achieve a target profit? The formula says fixed cost plus the target profit divided by contribution margin ratio. We've already defined contribution margin ratio. So your contribution margin ratio, like we said, it is your contribution divided by selling price. Then also, finally, 5, we have your margin of safety. Your margin of safety is calculated as your projected sales minus your projected or break-even sales rather. The difference between these two is your margin of safety. So your margin of safety, like we showed in the diagram, from the break-even points here in this diagram, from this break-even point up to their highest level of sales. Let's assume that this is your budgeted sales level here. So you can see that from this point upwards, they started from the break-even points, they started making profits because the sales line is higher than the cost line. So we are saying, let's say this is the highest level of sales. It means from the break-even line up, they are making profits. They are safe. This is say within this margin, they are safe. That's what we mean by the margin of safety. So what it means that, let's say this place, let's put here as our break-even. So let's say here is our projected sales. So the difference between this break-even sales and the budgeted sales is the margin of safety. Because at that point, from the break-even sales upward, the company is making profits. So what it means is that we are safe at that point. So that's your margin of safety. Now, margin of safety can be calculated in relative terms and in absolute. In absolute terms, I will use an example. Let's say, for instance, that our budgeted sales was 10 million, was, let's say, 15 million. 15 million. 15 million. Why the break-even sales is 10 million? Whether naira or units, whichever one you want to use it, but the same thing applies. So if it is whether in value or in units, so what it means is that the difference here is 5 million. So your margin of safety, let me check this by a margin of safety is equal to 15 million minus 10 million equals to 5 million. This is in absolute terms, In relative terms, your margin of safety will be margin of safety in relative terms means relating it with in relative terms, it will be this 5 million margin of safety divided by relating it with your budgeted sales, which is your optimal level of sales, 15 million. So that will give us approximately 30%. So that's your margin of safety in relative terms. This doesn't just go like this. Like if we are looking at the margin of safety, the absolute term is 5 million. If you are speaking to management, the assumption is that they are not accountants, so you need to explain to them what 5 million margin of safety means. So what it means is that sales should not fall by more than 5 million from the budgeted sales level. If not, a loss will result. So if we are using the diagram, so this is about, I think this is supposed to be 33%. So if we are looking using this diagram, you can see that from this budgeted sales level, yeah, within here and here, remember we said it is 5 million. So if sales fall by more than 5 million, it means we will fall into this axis, and where it is a loss, we'll start making loss. Same thing apply by 33%. You say also that if sales fall by more than 33% from the budgeted sales level, we'll start making the loss. So sales should not fall by 33%, if not a loss will result. That's what we mean by the margin of safety of 33%. We have also what we call the PV ratio, just to mention profit volume ratio. Profit volume ratio. Or which we will call PV ratio. The profit volume ratio is calculated the same way you calculate your PV, your contribution. It's the same as your contribution margin ratio. This profit volume ratio just studies the relationship between your profits and the volume of activity. Just only between these two, costs not involved. Like the CVP, which is the cost volume profit analysis, is talking about the profit relationship between the cost, profit, and volume of activity. But here we are looking at profit and volume of activity, which has also a different. But remember, the computation is the same as the contribution margin ratio, which is giving us also your contribution margin divided by selling price. This can also be calculated in total, which will mean in total it will be contribution, full contribution, divided by sales. Or if you're doing it per unit, you say contribution margin or contribution for 1 unit divided by selling price. We still give you your contribution margin ratio or your PV. Also your PV ratio.